I read The Salaryman's Wife by Sujata Massey. This is a murder mystery, and it's the first time that I've read this book. It's part of a larger series, but I don't plan to read the next book in the series after this or anything, although I might read it in the future because this was really fun, by the numbers murder mystery, but it had lots of great details, great characters, and was just a lot of fun to spend some time with. So the story is about Rei Shimura, who is the detective, quote unquote, of the series. And like a lot of great detective stories now in the modern genre, although this comes out of the late 90s, and so it was probably more part of the emerging trend at the time, which is just kind of standard now. Ray is not a detective in the police department or like a private detective or anything like that. She just kind of trips into becoming a detective and has her own job and problems that are like completely separate and kind of interfere or come in between her and the mystery throughout the story. So Ray lives in Japan. She is part Japanese. Her father was Japanese. Her mother was American. And she was raised in America, but she has family in Japan. She's trying to make a go of it as an adult in Japan. She's in her late 20s, and she wants to work in antiquities. That's what she has a degree in, but she can only get a job as an English teacher for a corporation. So she's like teaching the corporate executives how to speak English conversationally. And then, that helps them to do business all across the globe. But it's not what she wants to be doing necessarily. So Ray takes a vacation during the New Year's time of year up in the Japanese Alps and at a little, hotel in the middle of nowhere kind of situation. And while she's there are a few other guests, including other people who are not native Japanese. There's a guy from Scotland, there's an American woman, and then there's a businessman and his wife. And this wife is the titular salaryman's wife. So she comes across as really spoiled and privileged and annoying. But then she gets murdered while they're up there at the hotel. And it doesn't look like a murder at first. It appears to be a suicide. We're told that a lot of times people during New Year's will go out naked into the snow and lay down and let themselves freeze to death. And this is a form of suicide because their debts or their life is so humiliating that they can't take it anymore. And, kind of looking past what happened over the last year and looking forward into the future, they just, give in to despair and kill themselves. And that is what they say happened to this salaryman's wife named Setsuko. And so all of these other people at the hotel become kind of the prime suspects for Ray tracking down like who did it for the rest of the book. And I think right away there's a lot of interesting things that are set up in the story by Massey where we're not dealing with, a homogeneous kind of cultural experience, because we have people from all over the world who happen to be in this one place, and the Japanese attitude about foreigners interacting with that. And so there's this clash of Japanese culture with a kind of like intrinsic way of being that is unacceptable to the Japanese. So like the lady who runs the hotel doesn't like foreigners, and she doesn't like Ray because she has a kind of American accent and she's visibly not, quote unquote, fully Japanese. There's a racism happening here in the way that Ray is being treated. And she often has run into this while trying to get work in Tokyo. So on the one hand, she has a really hard time because she is a woman. That's why she can't break into the field that she's trying to get into. The other thing is she doesn't really know anybody, and you kind of need connections to get past the initial hiring phase. Like nobody's going to hire you if you don't have leverage or know somebody on the inside. And then her American heritage also is a way of her not belonging, but it is a way in which she occupies a kind of liminal space, which is a really important symbolic feature for the detective as an archetype. And so the detective always has like one foot in the criminal world and one foot in the legitimate kind of legal culture. And that is the space that their heroism has to operate in, right? Like they are the ones who pull the criminals back into the civilized space and thereby kind of render justice back into society. Like it's getting invaded by the criminal, and then the detective is the only one who can cross that space and capture the criminal and keep the society safe. But this is further underlined, I think, for Ray because of her mixed heritage. And it's the thing that allows her to connect with the American woman, Marcel, who kind of becomes like her roommate, sort of like they meet on the train on the way there. And then the hotel lady is like, "Oh, do you guys want to have an adjoining room with each other?" And Marcel just kind of like gloms onto her and like they wants to hang out with her all the time. She seems really lonely. She talks about how she doesn't have her husband anymore. She's traveling the world the way that she always wanted to. She's been all over Asia now and she wants to go to different places in Japan. And she doesn't speak Japanese. She's American. And so Ray being able to speak English, but also to understand American culture is a beacon for her, to hang out with somebody like that. And then in addition to that, she meets this guy named Hugh Glendinning, who is a Scotsman, a businessman who is staying at the hotel along with the salaryman and the salaryman's wife. They're business partners and they're kind of doing some business while they're here. And they meet in a kind of like hilarious misunderstanding because he doesn't speak Japanese or read Japanese. And so he goes into the woman's only bathing room, and Ray is, of course, bathing naked, and he comes in naked. And so they see each other, and she is immediately attracted to him. There's an attraction between them right away, but there's also like embarrassment and outrage and shame and all that stuff too. And so like a lot of tension that happens right there, right away, but they are able to communicate with each other because he speaks English, she speaks English, and then she's able to translate for him throughout the story. The businessman, his name is Takio, and he's just kind of like the typical, like salaryman who stays at work too long, probably cheats on his wife. He's deep in the world of corporate secrets. He's kind of tied up with Yakuza stuff. And so he seems like a likely suspect right from the beginning. And so does Hugh. The police tend to suspect foreigners, which again is another part of the racism that goes throughout the novel. And the way in which, you're looking at the inside the law, outside the law, the police tend to see this, there's not a liminal zone there. There's like a very hard line. And the people who are outside of the Japanese culture are automatically suspicious because inside is, obedience and lawfulness, and anything outside of that is just associated with criminality automatically. And so Ray's, kind of being a half-breed, if you will, causes her a problem with the police, and everybody kind of mistreats her and is rude to her because of her American accent, in that way of like associating her with a criminal. And it happens throughout the story. She's, like assumed to be associating with criminals because of her non-Japanese heritage. And so these are all the suspects that we have for the story. And there is an autopsy that is done on Setsuko's body, and it's discovered that she had like some bruising on the back of her head, but she was found face down in the snow naked, and there were no footprints in the snow leading up to where her body was. And it was as if she fell out of the window to the bathing room of the hotel. And so like all these details don't add up, and Ray is suspicious of like what really happened because the police story doesn't really make sense to her. And it seems like they're just kind of being lazy. And the way that she gets the autopsy is because Hugh steals it when it's printed out and makes a copy and then returns the original, but he can't read it because it's in Japanese. And so he needs Ray to read it for him. And Ray's brother is a doctor. And so she gets him to not only read it, but kind of like interpret it because it's, full of medical details and she's not trained in that. And so this is the way in which I say, that like Ray is this liminal character who is able to cross into different zones. And that is the soul of what the detective is, a person who can pass between all of these different zones and therefore, choose to protect the regular non-criminal civilian population, right? So Ray can like interact with doctors, with high-powered businessmen, and also, with murderers, because one of the people that she got to know here is a murderer. And so her brother is the one who tells her what's going on, how the details don't quite add up. She calls up the police detective in charge of the investigation who said it was a suicide and tells him about all of this, gets him in touch with her brother, and also mentions that the way that she got the autopsy was from Hugh, and that sends the detective to go get Hugh and imprison him. Now, before all that happened, this is an important detail that I just kind of skipped over. Hugh and Ray get closer and closer while they're going through this investigation. He's very upset because, he was friends with Setsuko and he was also like wrapped up in an investigation where she was an informant for him, which we find out later. And so he cared a lot about, he didn't want her to die. And so he is very passionate about figuring out what exactly happened and why and who did it. And Ray is kind of carried along into that investigation by him. And so they work together closely. They get more and more attracted to each other, and then they finally give in to their attraction and they have sex one night. And then after that is when he gets arrested by the Japanese police, which is a really serious thing to happen for a foreigner, because if it goes to trial, they talk about how the conviction rate in Japan is like 99% of cases that go to trial end up with the defendant going to jail. And they are extra hard on non-Japanese people throughout the entire system. And so now Ray feels responsible for this happening. She tries to like get him out in all kinds of various ways. And at the same time, she continues with the investigation to try and figure out what exactly is happening, what would be the motivation for someone to kill her, and, why is all this happening? And then at various times, people try to kill Ray herself. And it turns out that the Yakuza is all mixed up in this. We also meet her roommate, who's named Richard, and he's an American kid who is hilarious. He's a great character. And they live in like a really crappy apartment with no heat, and there's like one bedroom, and it's like a terrible in your 20s kind of situation. They're just barely scraping by. Rei's parents are constantly telling her to like, you should just get out of Japan, forget this. Your life is terrible. She's also, in the midst of all of this, trying to like teach her classes and be on time with that. But also she wants, to do this whole thing with antiques and, the artifacts of ancient civilizations and things like that. And so she's always going to the museum or looking through catalogs about various things. And so there's like a lot of elements of her life that are crossing up this investigation and the drama of it all the time that add a really good sense of tension, I think, and put her in a space where like she doesn't have a lot of privilege. She's really desperate to get into the field of study that she wants to, but because of that, it underlines the way in which she has a lot of integrity because she doesn't really have time to do this. She doesn't have the resources or the authority to solve a murder, but she sticks to it anyway because that's how much she cares about the truth. And she also wants to try and help defend Hugh. And her and Hugh are like, they go from hot to cold, hot to cold. It's a really good romance, actually, I think. They're mad at each other at different points, and then they're passionately in love again. They forgive each other. And so there's lots of, I guess what I'm saying is that there's just lots of dramatic motion throughout the entire story to keep things really interesting, eventful, keep your attention really focused all the time. She uncovers all kinds of secrets that boil down to the fact that Setsuko was also a American, she had like American blood in her, so to speak. Her grandfather was American, and so she was like 1/4 not Japanese. And she was running a blackmail operation on her relatives in America to expose the kind of scandal of, he had a second family, you never knew about it, and this would, cause a scandal, like I say, and trying to get money out of them over that. Simultaneously, she's revealing all kinds of corporate secrets from her husband's business to Hugh, who is doing a kind of industrial espionage thing for the European Union government that is real shady and crappy and makes Rei angry. And so again, there's like this, is he like a criminal? Is it as bad as murder? No, not really. But he is kind of a criminal. But is it really that bad? So again, there's all this liminality in the shades of gray in the story. And I think in a lot of ways, like Hugh respects Rei so much because of her reaction to the whole thing. He knows that she won't like it, even though he doesn't see it as a big deal. But I think he respects her integrity a lot. And over the course of the story, comes to fall in love with her in a really deep and genuine way that helps to reform him out of that behavior where he's not going to be involved in that whole situation anymore by the end. And so her integrity, her sense of justice, her pursuit of the truth doesn't arc her out of anything, but it does arc the characters around her who care about her into better situations. Like by the end of the story, Richard is moving into a better apartment with a better job. Hugh is moving, out of his rich lifestyle, kind of being a spy for the EU, into more legitimate stuff that he's not sure how it's going to pan out. And her boss at the corporate job where she teaches English comes to respect her integrity so much and her hard work that he helps her to get a promotion into the thing that she's actually interested in doing, working with artifacts and whatnot, and bankrolls her first antique sale to the tune of like, millions of yen. And so allowing her to set up an independent business and get going. And so her integrity is both rewarded in the story and is a source of change for all of the characters around her, which is typical, I think, in the detective genre. Sometimes the detectives are down and dirty and they're anti-heroes, but more often they're kind of paragons. And that's the case with Ray, I think. And she makes people who are a little sketchy into more upstanding people. And what ends up being the case is that the American woman who she met at the hotel on the train and stuff, Miss Marcel, is the wife of the man who was the victim's grandfather. And so she wants revenge for kind of smearing his name and trying to get anything out of their family. And she's like a just vindictive, cruel person. And she tries to, she does murder, the woman, of course. And then she tries to like also murder Ray for figuring everything out. So we go through a list of like red herrings that has to do with Satsuna's illegitimate daughter and her Yakuza involved husband, and maybe the Yakuza itself, and maybe the police were involved and all this stuff. And it leads to more and more scandal. But at the end of the day, it's the American who did it. And so there's a kind of confirmation of the suspicions of the police that you have this inside-outside duality. The Japanese are good, the foreigners are bad. And that is the case, in the story, that this woman who seems like the sweetest, nicest person who's just trying to have a vacation and needs Ray's help is actually a malignant force who murders Japanese women in the night. But as the story ends, Ray is kind of affirming her Japanese heritage. She's refusing to take the ride back to her parents' place. They give her like airplane ticket to come home, and she won't use it. She won't go back to America. She is pushing away on her American heritage and investing more deeply in her Japanese heritage. She's got a Japanese job now. She's got a new Japanese apartment. She's got a boyfriend in Japan now. And so I think symbolically, you can see that the American getting arrested, the American being guilty of murder, is a way of the story kind of rejecting that aspect of herself, even though it's part of what gives her the ability to step into various worlds. She's not denying it in herself, but she is instead, I guess, choosing and affirming the Japanese side of herself. She is going inside the Japanese circle and stepping away from that outside foreigners circle. And so I think the story feels like really coherent because of that, because the way in which the murderer kind of represents the change that she makes, the choice that she makes in this first book in the series, really like sets it down a path to examine probably Ray's identity over time. Like I would expect the books to continue to delve into the trouble of her having this dual identity and having now chosen the Japanese side of herself, and will that lead to problems down the line in the other books? I suspect that it would. So I think Massey is really like setting herself up narratively for a very rich place to continue to tell stories with this detective who is a really interesting, rich character because she has all of these interests and capabilities and heritage in this very strict culture where she's not accepted on all kinds of levels of her identity, but where she is also, so upright and has such integrity that people can't help but be moved by her behavior. So just a really great detective story that was a lot of fun to read. So I really enjoyed it.